Welcome back, MC Time Trackers. Today, we set out on a journey through both history and language, a dual mission where English isn't just studied, it's experienced. This isn't only a story of the past. It's a living lesson where every word you hear carries the weight of human struggle, the rise of nations, and the echoes of time itself. Because when you learn English through history, you're not just memorizing phrases. You're feeling the heartbeat of humanity, its courage, its pain, and its endless will to survive. So, before we begin, I want you to be fully present. Turn off distractions. Take a breath. Let the rhythm of my voice and the pulse of the story pull you in. Don't just listen, echo the words in your mind. Mimic their tone, their pace, their emotion. Let English flow through you, not as a subject, but as a story. And remember, if you can't finish this journey today, the past will wait for you. History is patient. It never goes away. So get ready, explorers. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history, it's the living language of time. And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you'll never miss a story from MC Time Trackers. The Rise of North Korea. Crowds of North Koreans cried and screamed in the streets, falling to the ground in sorrow. Their leader, Kim Jong-un, was dead, or so they believed. To outsiders, their grief might seem strange, but to them, they were mourning a god. This small, secretive nation, feared for its weapons and isolation, had once again shown the world the strange power of the Kim family. But how did such a dynasty come to rule one of the most mysterious countries on Earth? Our story begins long before Kim Jong-un. In 1905, Japan took full control of the Korean peninsula. What they called a civilizing mission was, in truth, an occupation. Japan ran Korea like a military colony. Korean schools had armed teachers, and police controlled every part of life. Those who resisted were crushed. Still, the dream of freedom never died. By 1919, inspired by ideas of independence spreading after World War I, Koreans rose up. The Japanese answered with blood. In one brutal massacre, hundreds were locked inside a church and burned alive. But from the ashes, something new began to grow. A powerful wave of nationalism, and within it, the seed of communism. Communism promised equality and liberation from empires. In the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds, young revolutionaries across Asia believed it could free their homelands. Among them was a boy named Kim Il-sung, born in 1912 near Pyongyang. His parents, Christian activists, fled to China when he was small. There, Kim discovered the writings of Lenin and Marx. He joined the Chinese Communist Party in 1931 and soon took up arms against Japan. Kim proved a talented guerrilla fighter. In 1937, he led 200 men across the Korean border and attacked the Japanese at the Battle of Pochanbo. They burned police stations and government offices, striking the empire's heart. North Korean propaganda would later call this the dawn of liberation. Kim's legend was born. But Japan hunted him relentlessly. After losing many of his followers and perhaps even his first wife, Kim fled to the Soviet Union. There, he joined the Red Army and waited out World War II. Then, in 1945, everything changed. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Korea from the north. American troops landed in the south. When the dust settled, Korea was split at the 38th parallel, a line drawn in half an hour by 2 U.S. officers. It would become one of the most dangerous borders in the world. The Soviets needed a local leader they could trust. Stalin chose Kim Il-sung, the Tiger of Korea. In 1945, Kim returned home as the new face of Korean communism. By 1948, he became premier of the newly created Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. Not everyone accepted him. Rival factions existed, some backed by China, some by Moscow, others by Southern communists. Kim outmaneuvered them all. He seized land from landlords and gave it to peasants. He nationalized banks, factories, and transport, declaring equality for men and women alike. Within a few years, North Korea's economy began to rise from the ruins of war. Kim also built his power through the military. His old guerrilla army became the Korean People's Army, created in 1948. With Soviet weapons, tanks, and planes, it quickly grew into one of the strongest forces in Asia. Meanwhile, in the South, the United Nations held elections that the Soviets boycotted. On the 15th of August, 1948, South Korea was born under Syngman Rhee. North Korea answered with its own declaration weeks later, on September 9, claiming to be the true Korea. By 1949, Kim was ready to reunify the peninsula by force. The U.S. had withdrawn most of its troops from the South. The North's army was larger, better equipped, and full of confidence. Communism seemed unstoppable. The Soviets had tested their first atomic bomb, and Mao's communists had just won in China. Both Stalin and Mao encouraged Kim's plan for invasion. Stalin promised weapons, though not soldiers. Mao sent 50,000 Chinese troops to help. Tensions rose along the 38th parallel, with small battles breaking out through early 1950. Then, on the 25th of June, 1950, the war began. North Korean tanks rolled across the border, igniting one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century, the Korean War. The Korean War and the birth of Juche. June 25th, 1950. The earth shook beneath the roar of North Korean tanks as they thundered across the 38th parallel. Planes screamed overhead, soldiers marched south, and within days, war had begun. The Northern Army was twice the size of the South's. Its air force outnumbered the enemy 10-1, and while the North had almost 300 tanks, the South had none. Seoul fell in just 5 days. Nearly 80% of the South Korean army was killed, captured, or had deserted. The few American troops on the peninsula could only retreat. Behind the lines, Kim Il-sung's forces hunted down anyone considered an enemy: politicians, scholars, and business leaders. Thousands were executed. Kim was certain his dream of reunification was about to come true. But the world would not let it happen. The United Nations condemned the invasion within 2 days and called for a joint military response. The United States, fearing a communist domino effect in Asia, took the lead. General Douglas MacArthur, hero of the Pacific, was placed in command. On September 15, 1950, UN forces landed at Incheon in the largest amphibious assault since World War II. It was a stunning success. North Korean lines collapsed. Tens of thousands were captured. By the end of September, Seoul was free again, and the UN Army had pushed all the way back to the 38th parallel. Kim's grand victory had turned into disaster. In October, UN troops invaded North Korea. Pyongyang fell within weeks. Kim and his government fled into hiding. But as the army collapsed, a new terror came from the sky. The U.S. Air Force began a relentless bombing campaign. City after city vanished beneath fire and smoke. By late 1950, Pyongyang had no major buildings left standing. Villages were erased, farmlands burned. By the time the bombing stopped, an estimated 80% of all buildings in North Korea had been destroyed. Some say Nearly 1 in 10 North Koreans were killed. To this day, that destruction fuels the deep hatred of America that runs through North Korean propaganda and society. Then, everything changed again. China warned the UN not to cross too close to its border. When those warnings were ignored, October 25th, 1950, waves of Chinese troops, tens of thousands, poured across the Yalu River. The UN was caught completely off guard. North Korea rose again from the ashes. Pyongyang was recaptured. Seoul fell once more. Kim Il-sung's emotions were mixed. His country was saved, but it was China doing most of the fighting. Stalin and Mao both blamed Kim's failures for starting a war that had spiraled out of control. By early 1951, the UN regrouped. In March, Seoul changed hands for the fourth and final time. By July, the war returned to the 38th parallel, where it would freeze for 2 more brutal years. From 1951 to 1953, the Korean War became a nightmare of trenches and attrition. Millions died. Neither side advanced. Finally, on July 27, 1953, both sides signed an armistice. Not peace, just silence. The fighting stopped, prisoners were exchanged, and a new border was created. The Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. The war never truly ended. For 70 years, that line has remained a scar across the Korean peninsula. North Korea emerged shattered. Its economy had collapsed by 75%. Cities lay in ruins. The army was almost gone. Yet Kim Il-sung remained. He promised a new beginning, 4 goals to rebuild his broken nation. First, he vowed to strengthen the people's democratic system, meaning total loyalty to communist ideology. Second, to rebuild the economy and improve living standards. Third, to fortify national defense so the country would never again be so helpless. And finally, the eternal dream reunification of Korea. To achieve these goals, Kim rebuilt the party through massive re-education campaigns. But he also began to purge anyone who might challenge him. Rival communists were blamed for the war's failures. Soviet Korean leader Ho Ka-i was accused of incompetence and soon committed suicide. Another rival, Pak Han-young, was branded an American spy, put on trial, and executed in 1955. Hundreds more were imprisoned or killed. Kim's power became absolute. Now, with no one left to oppose him, Kim created an idea that would define North Korea forever, Juche. Introduced in 1955, it meant self-reliance. North Korea, Kim declared, must stand on its own in every way, economically, militarily, and spiritually. The country would grow its own food, make its own weapons, and trust no one but itself. Foreign trade and influence were seen as weakness. Juche was not only a policy, it was a religion of national pride. Under Juche, loyalty to the country meant loyalty to Kim himself. He became Suryong, the great leader, the living embodiment of the nation. To insult Kim was to betray Korea. His image appeared everywhere, in schools, homes, and offices. It was a crime to damage a photo of him, or even fold a newspaper with his name printed on it. Worship of the leader became law. But not everyone approved. After Stalin's death, new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev condemned the cult of personality. He demanded that other communist nations abandon their ruler worship. In 1956, Kim was summoned to Moscow and sharply criticized. While he was away, his pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese rivals plotted to remove him, accusing him of tyranny and favoritism. They underestimated how far Kim Il-sung had come and how deep his control had already grown. The Purge and the Illusion of Prosperity. When Kim Il-sung returned to Pyongyang in late August 1956, the air was thick with tension. The annual party meeting had begun, but this time, the great leader was not greeted with praise. On stage, two men, Pak Chung-ok, leader of the Soviet faction, and Cho Chang-ik, head of the Yan'an faction, rose to speak. In front of the entire assembly, they denounced Kim as a tyrant, an egomaniac who had betrayed the socialist cause. But they had made a fatal mistake. Their roots lay in Moscow and Beijing, not in Korea. The people saw them as foreigners, puppets of outside powers. Kim, on the other hand, was a national hero, the guerrilla who had fought to free Korea. He embodied Juche, the spirit of self-reliance. His critics were shouted down, their voices drowned by chants of loyalty. Within days, the party voted to expel both men. Over the next months, dozens of their followers vanished, arrested, sent to labor camps, or executed in secret. The Soviet and Yan'an factions were wiped out completely. By 1960, both Pak and Cho were dead. Even the Soviets and Chinese begged Kim to stop the bloodshed. He ignored them. North Korea now had only one voice, Kim Il-sung's. With politics settled, Kim turned his attention to rebuilding the nation. In August 1953, he announced a 3-year plan to restore the economy between 1954 and 1956. Heavy industry would come first, mining, steel, and construction. More than 80% of all state investment went into factories and machinery. Workers were ordered to labor for the glory of the state, their progress measured by strict quotas. By 1957, Pyongyang proudly declared success. Industry and agriculture had returned to pre-war levels. But the truth was darker. The obsession with quotas forced local officials to lie about their production numbers. Those who failed were punished. So lies piled upon lies. The government believed food was plentiful when in reality there was not enough to feed the people. In 1955, famine struck. Thousands starved. Later Soviet archives revealed that as many as 800,000 people may have died. East German observers believed that 1 in 4 North Korean children perished. Beijing and Moscow sent food aid, but Kim's regime buried the tragedy. The outside world would not learn the truth for decades. Still, Kim declared victory and launched a new 5-year plan from 1957 to 1961. This time, he promised not just recovery, but modernization. Yet once again, the focus remained on heavy industry. Ordinary people still lacked homes, clothing, and food. Both China and the USSR urged Kim to shift priorities, but he refused. Instead, he introduced the Chalima movement, named after the mythical flying horse. It was a vast propaganda campaign, urging workers to move faster, produce more, and build harder. Factories and farms competed for medals and honors. Posters celebrated Cholima riders as heroes of the nation. Kim himself began the tradition of on-the-spot guidance, visiting work sites to inspire laborers and demonstrate his great wisdom. These visits became legendary scenes in North Korean propaganda and continue even today. By 1958, every farm had been collectivized. The next year, all industries and trade were fully nationalized. The state controlled everything: production, distribution, and even hunger. But this so-called progress came at a terrible cost. Workers were exhausted, driven by impossible targets. Those who fell behind were shamed, punished, or imprisoned. The government even launched the Drink No Soup campaign, urging workers to skip meals so they wouldn't waste time on bathroom breaks. By the late 1952, the illusion began to crumble. Production numbers looked impressive, but quality collapsed. Machines broke down, goods were poorly made, and real living standards barely improved. In 1959, North Korea claimed to have met its quotas early. The statistics painted a picture of triumph. A per capita GDP of $140, compared to South Korea's $81. But these numbers hid the truth. Most people lived in poverty, malnourished and desperate. Behind the facade of prosperity, the regime tightened control over society. In 1957, Kim introduced a new social system called songbun, a kind of caste system that still exists today. Every citizen was ranked by their family's loyalty to the revolution. Those from guerrilla families or peasants loyal to Kim formed the core class, about 28% of the population. They were trusted, privileged, and could rise in society. Next came the wavering class, nearly half the nation teachers, small traders, or anyone with foreign or middle-class roots. They were tolerated, but watched closely. And at the bottom were the hostile class, descendants of landlords, Christians, defectors, or anyone tied to the South, about 27% of the population. They lived under constant suspicion and surveillance. Songbun determined everything: where you could live, what job you had, who you could marry, even how much food you received. Good deeds might raise your rank, but one mistake could destroy your family's future for generations. Meanwhile, the regime's propaganda machine filled the air with fantasies. Newspapers boasted that North Korea had no crime, no poverty, no disease. Teachers claimed there was no blindness or deafness among children. Divorce and alcoholism did not exist. And, of course, there were no homosexuals, since, as the regime claimed, everyone was perfectly socialist. But foreign visitors noticed something eerie. Despite the war's many wounded, they never saw a single person with scars, missing limbs, or disabilities. "What happened to them all?" one visitor asked. The answer was whispered, never printed. Those who did not fit the image of perfection were hidden or erased. For them, there was only one destination: the camps. Borrowed from Stalin's gulags, North Korea's prisons were brutal labor colonies. A careless word, a missed quota, or a rumor of disloyalty could send a person away forever. Trials were meaningless performances. The verdict was always the same: guilty. The camps had two kinds: Kyo-hwaso, or re-education centers for minor offenders, and Kwan-li-so, concentration camps for political prisoners. Those who entered the latter rarely came out. There, in the frozen mountains, the illusion of paradise ended and the true face of the regime began. The Cold War heats again. Inside North Korea's prisons, life meant survival, barely. Inmates lived in freezing barracks, fed just enough to keep breathing. Guards beat them with rifle butts and steel rods. One former guard later said that at least a third of prisoners were mutilated, missing fingers, ears, or eyes. To the regime, these people were not human. In North Korean captivity, there were no rights, no mercy, no escape. By the early 1962, Kim Il-sung's rule was unshakable. His enemies were dead or buried in camps. The economy was recovering, and society had been reshaped in his image. Now, Kim looked outward. He wanted North Korea to stand tall, industrial, modern, and strong. At first, he followed the familiar path, rely on Soviet machinery. But deals with Moscow soured. The Soviets charged high prices, and Kim hated being dependent. So he did the unthinkable. He turned to the West. Under a new slogan, the Great Leap Onward, North Korea began importing Western technology. Billions of dollars of equipment arrived on credit, about $1 billion from Japan alone. Western companies saw profit, and Kim saw opportunity. With these machines, North Korea built the world's largest cement factory, new steel mills, paper plants, and fertilizer complexes. For a few brief years, trade with the West made up nearly 40% of the nation's commerce. But it was all built on borrowed money. When the bills came due, Pyongyang simply refused to pay. The doors to Western trade slammed shut, and the Hermit Kingdom retreated once more into isolation. Still, those years brought a few unusual stories, among them the tale of James Joseph Dresnok. A troubled American soldier, Dresnok's life had fallen apart. His parents divorced, his wife left him, and he faced a court-martial while stationed in South Korea. On August 15, 1962, he made a desperate choice. He ran across a minefield in the demilitarized zone and surrendered to North Korean guards. Interrogators at first thought he was a spy, but soon realized he wanted to stay. To their surprise, the regime accepted him. Dresnok became one of at least 7 American defectors to North Korea. He taught English, acted in propaganda films, and lived the rest of his life in Pyongyang. Though closely monitored and sometimes beaten, he remained loyal to the country that had become his strange new home until his death in 2016. His children still live there today. Defectors like Dresnok were rare curiosities, symbols of Western failure. But Kim Il-sung's real focus was the military. In the 1,960 seconds, he rebuilt his shattered army, declaring the motto, "Arms in one hand, hammer and sickle in the other." Every citizen had to serve 8 years in the military. Soldiers not fighting wars were sent to build roads, farms, and factories. The army was both labor force and political school, training citizens to worship the state. Even children as young as 7 practiced with rifles. Kim's new doctrine, called Byungjin, linked weapons and economy, 2 halves of one purpose. A strong army would drive national strength. Factories would feed the soldiers. The idea endures in North Korea to this day. Yet, as Kim's power grew, his paranoia deepened. In the late 1,960 seconds, he purged top generals, the Minister of National Security, the Chief of Intelligence, the Navy Commander, and many others. Most were not enemies, merely victims of Kim's constant need for control. Abroad, his allies were growing uneasy. Moscow disapproved of Kim's personality cult, while Beijing distrusted him altogether. China's leaders still remembered how North Korea's weakness had forced them to fight and bleed in the Korean War. When Mao Zedong launched China's Cultural Revolution in 1966, sending his Red Guards to destroy old traditions, Kim denounced the movement. To him, it was chaos, dangerous, and undisciplined. The Red Guards struck back with words, calling Kim a fat revisionist unworthy of communism. The insult burned deeply. Determined to prove his revolutionary strength, Kim turned again to the one tool he trusted: violence. Inspired by the Viet Cong, he ordered guerrilla units to infiltrate South Korea. Throughout 1966, clashes along the DMZ skyrocketed. Small skirmishes erupted almost daily. The fragile truce from 1953 seemed to be dissolving. Some later called this period a second Korean War. Then, Kim's ambition reached new heights. He planned to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-hee. On the night of January 17, 1968, 31 elite North Korean commandos crossed the border. Their target, the Blue House, the president's residence in Seoul. They had trained for months and rehearsed the attack dozens of times. For several days, they moved unseen until they met 4 South Korean woodcutters. Instead of killing them, the commandos tried to convert them, preaching communist ideals. They let them go, believing propaganda would win them over. It was a fatal mistake. The woodcutters ran straight to the police. Within hours, Seoul was on high alert. Yet the commandos pressed on, disguised in South Korean uniforms. On January 20th, they walked calmly through the capital, carrying rifles under their coats. They got within 800 meters of the Blue House before policemen stopped them. Their cover blown, they opened fire. 1 policeman died, 2 attackers fell, and the rest scattered. A massive manhunt followed. American and South Korean troops hunted the fugitives for days. Of the 31 infiltrators, 29 were killed, 1 captured, and 1 escaped back north. The Blue House raid had failed, but only barely. Had those 4 civilians stayed silent, history might have been very different. Just 3 days later, another crisis erupted. North Korea seized the USS Pueblo, a U.S. spy ship, gathering intelligence off its coast. 1 American sailor was killed, and the rest were taken prisoner. As Washington dealt with the chaos of the Vietnam War, it could only negotiate. For 11 months, the crew endured torture before finally being released. By early 1968, Pyongyang was bracing for war. Schools closed, civilians were evacuated, and hundreds of new infiltrators were sent south. One mission ended with the massacre of a South Korean family on Jabang Mountain, including a 10-year-old boy. The border once again trembled on the edge of fire. From the axe murder to the rising air. The murder at Jabang Mountain, a South Korean family, including a 10-year-old boy, shocked the world. It hardened Seoul's resolve and deepened the cycle of retaliation along the border. Yet by 1969, the endless skirmishes finally began to fade. No one knows exactly why. Perhaps the Soviets and Chinese had pressured Kim to stop. Perhaps fear of full-scale war or exhaustion at home forced Pyongyang to ease off. Whatever the reason, the tension cooled. By late 1969, the USS Pueblo crew was released, and clashes along the DMZ dropped to pre-1966 levels. It had been a pointless conflict, hundreds of Americans and South Koreans dead, and hundreds more North Koreans lost all for nothing. Yet as the guns fell silent, North Korea entered the 1972nd, not as a ruined country, but as one that seemed, at least for a while, to be thriving. During this period, North Korea's economy actually rivaled South Korea's. In the 1960s and early 70s, the North's per capita GDP was equal or even slightly higher than that of the South. The cities glowed with electricity, almost every home connected to the power grid. By the mid-1970s, nearly 70% of the population lived in urban areas. Education flourished. Every child attended school, and the nation boasted more than 200 universities, all with free tuition. One of North Korea's greatest successes was its healthcare system. Despite being poor, Pyongyang introduced free medical care, mandatory health checkups, and vaccination programs. Hospitals were basic but widespread. Even today, North Korea's life expectancy around 73 years is unusually high for a country of its means. But Kim Il-sung had promised far more. He once declared that every citizen would wear silk, live beneath a tiled roof, and eat 3 meals a day. Reality fell short. The dream of luxury remained distant, and by the mid-1970s, the North's progress began to unravel. The Chalima movement had driven its workers to exhaustion. Production dropped. The Western loans that once funded Pyongyang's industrial rise had come due, and the regime could not pay. The 1973 oil crisis sent shockwaves through the global economy, and North Korea's fragile system began to buckle. In 1976, it stopped all debt repayments to Western creditors, a quiet admission of failure. Official statistics became pure fiction. Pyongyang merged numbers from successful industries like steel with failing ones like agriculture to create the illusion of growth. In truth, factories were stagnating, food shortages returned, and the dream of catching up to the developed world slipped away. Yet for ordinary North Koreans, life in the early 1970s didn't seem terrible. New housing projects reduced homelessness, and for a brief time, optimism lingered. But as South Korea and Japan surged into prosperity, the contrast became impossible to ignore. North Korea launched campaign after campaign to hide its decline, like the August 3rd consumer goods movement, a propaganda push urging citizens to buy useless, short-lived goods to inflate GDP. The scheme backfired. Poorly made products broke quickly, workers were overworked, and the endless cycle of making more only worsened the problem. By the late 1970s, North Korea had fallen behind. Its factories aged, its fields dried, and its pride began to crack. Pyongyang grew dependent once again on Soviet aid and diplomatic protection. The self-reliant nation had quietly become a vassal of the USSR. Meanwhile, the Cold War was shifting. After America's withdrawal from Vietnam, Kim Il-sung saw an opportunity. If Vietnam could defeat the U.S., he argued, surely Korea could be reunified. He turned to Mao Zedong, but China was no longer the same. Beijing wanted peace with the West. Nixon's visit in 1972 had opened the door to diplomacy, and Mao refused to risk it all on another Korean War. The dream of reunification was shelved once again. So Kim looked elsewhere for friends, wherever he could find them. He built bizarre alliances with dictators across the world, especially in Africa. In Equatorial Guinea, Kim befriended Francisco Macias Nguema, a man so brutal his country was called the Auschwitz of Africa. Nguema massacred hundreds of people in a stadium while pop music blared from the speakers. He called himself the Great Miracle. Kim Il-sung admired him. When Nguema sent his young daughter Monica to North Korea in 1979, it was as a gesture of friendship. Months later, Nguema was overthrown and executed, but Kim kept his promise. Monica was raised in Pyongyang, given the best education, and even today she calls Kim Il-sung her second father, writing books defending both men as victims of Western lies. But friendship with monsters did not fix North Korea's growing problems. Relations with the U.S. and South Korea stayed as tense as ever, and the DMZ remained one of the most dangerous borders on Earth. Then, in August 1976, came another flashpoint, one sparked, unbelievably, by a tree. Near a UN checkpoint, two American officers, Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett, led a team to trim a poplar tree that blocked their view of the border. A group of North Korean soldiers arrived, demanding they stop. The Americans ignored them and kept working. Suddenly, the North Koreans attacked 30 men armed with clubs and axes. Boniface was beaten to death. Barrett fled, but was hunted down and killed with his own tools. Both men were armed but never fired a shot. North Korea claimed it was American aggression, but the world saw the truth. Washington prepared a response, one that would make history. The mission was called Operation Paul Bunyan, after the giant lumberjack. The goal: cut the tree down, no matter what. Hundreds of soldiers gathered at the DMZ, backed by helicopters, tanks, bombers, and even an aircraft carrier. For 45 tense minutes, under the watch of astonished North Korean troops, the Americans chopped down the tree. The stump was left standing as a warning. North Korea was stunned. Kim Il-sung did not apologize, but he did express regret and called for calm. It was the closest he had ever come to admitting fault. The axe murder incident became legend, a reminder that even a tree could almost start a war. Yet through it all, Kim remained untouchable. By 1980, he was nearing 70. His economy had stalled, his allies had drifted, and the once great leader faced an uncertain future. But Kim already had a plan for North Korea's next chapter, his heir, hidden from the world for 3 decades, Kim Jong-il, the Prince of Propaganda and the Age of Terror. By the early 1972, a new figure was quietly rising in Pyongyang. His name was Kim Jong-il, the son of Kim Il-sung, the man who would soon inherit an entire nation. He joined the Central Committee in 1972, and by 1974, he was officially named his father's heir. For years, Kim Jong-il worked behind the scenes, learning how to manage the country's lifeblood, espionage, propaganda, and control. He was being trained not just to rule, but to shape reality itself. By the 1982, his face began appearing beside his father's in every home, every school, every public building in North Korea. State media began calling him the party center, the future of the revolution. His duty, they said, was to continue his father's work and keep the flame of Juche burning forever. Kim Jong-il was given one special mission: to reinvent how the world saw North Korea. He loved films obsessively. Despite his hatred of Western influence, he was a secret movie fanatic, owning thousands of banned foreign films. In his eyes, cinema was the perfect tool to glorify the revolution and spread his father's myth to the masses. He dreamed of creating a communist Hollywood, but there was a problem: North Korea simply didn't have the talent. The local film industry was small and hopelessly loyal to the regime's censors. Kim decided to fix that in a way only a Kim could. In January 1978, North Korean agents kidnapped Choi Eun-hee, one of South Korea's most famous actresses, from Hong Kong. She was taken by boat to Pyongyang, where she met Kim Jong-il himself. Despite the abduction, he treated her well, showing her theaters, operas, and lavish parties. Then, 6 months later, his agents struck again, this time capturing Shin Sang-ok, a renowned South Korean film director and Choi's former husband. Kim wanted them both to reunite them and force them to build his dream film empire. After several escape attempts, the two gave up. Remarried under the watchful eyes of their captors, they spent 8 long years making films for the regime. Their productions included patriotic dramas, war epics, and even a monster movie called Pulgasari, a North Korean version of Godzilla. The film told the story of a magic creature who helped peasants overthrow a greedy emperor, a thinly veiled allegory of Kim's own revolution. Ironically, even some Japanese critics later admitted it was better than a few real Godzilla movies. But Choi and Shin were still prisoners. During a 1986 trip to Vienna, they finally escaped their guards and ran to the U.S. Embassy. gaining asylum. They would later reveal everything about their years in captivity and North Korea's bizarre obsession with cinema. Sadly, many others who were abducted in the 1970 seconds never escaped. Throughout that decade, hundreds of foreigners, mostly Japanese, but also citizens from France, Malaysia, and other countries were kidnapped by North Korean agents. Victims ranged from young couples to teenagers, even a 3-year-old girl. They were taken to North Korea, given new homes, and forced to live there for the rest of their lives. Many were paired off with other captives to have children part of a secret program to create ethnically camouflaged spies. Children of mixed heritage could blend into other countries, making them perfect agents for the regime. North Korea also used a tactic called the seed-bearing strategy, sending young women abroad to seduce foreign politicians and businessmen. The goal was to produce children who could later be used for blackmail and influence. The true scale of these operations remains a mystery. Only in 2002 did North Korea finally admit to the abductions, claiming there had been only 13 victims. Japan says the number was far higher. Just 5 of the kidnapped citizens were ever returned. Dozens of others and their children simply vanished. As the 1980 seconds progressed, North Korea's behavior grew even more aggressive and deadly. 2 terrorist attacks in particular would shock the world and mark Kim Jong-il's arrival as a ruthless power behind the throne. The first came in October 1983, when South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan visited Rangoon, Burma, now Yangon, Myanmar. As he prepared to lay a wreath at a national monument, a bomb planted by North Korean agents exploded. The blast killed 21 people, including South Korea's foreign minister and deputy prime minister. President Chun survived only because traffic delayed his arrival. 1 North Korean agent was killed in a gunfight. Another confessed under interrogation, exposing Pyongyang's role. The attack horrified the world, especially Burma, which cut off all ties with North Korea. But Pyongyang showed no remorse. 4 years later came something even worse. On November 29, 1987, Korean Air Flight 858 exploded over the Andaman Sea, killing all 115 people aboard. The bomb had been planted by 2 North Korean agents using Japanese passports trained and ordered by Kim Jong-il himself. The goal was to terrify travelers and sabotage the upcoming 1988 Seoul Olympics. 1 agent, a young woman named Kim Hyun-hui, was captured alive after a failed suicide attempt. She later confessed everything, describing her years of training as a spy and her total indoctrination by the regime. Kim Hyun-hui was sentenced to death but later pardoned by South Korea, which saw her as a victim as much as a killer. She has since denounced the regime and lives under protection, still haunted by what she did. The world was furious. The U.S. officially labeled North Korea a state sponsor of terrorism, and even longtime allies began to recoil. In Pyongyang, however, life went on. The regime built monuments to distract from its crimes. Vast projects like the Nampo Dam, completed in 1986, a true feat of engineering, and the Juche Tower, a 560-foot pillar glorifying Kim Il-sung's ideology, but their grandest dream became their greatest embarrassment. In 1987, construction began on the Ryugyong Hotel, a 1,000-foot pyramid meant to dominate the Pyongyang skyline and show the world North Korea's modern power. Instead, it became a hollow shell. Poor design and lack of funds halted construction, leaving the building empty and unfinished, a monument to vanity, waste, and decline. As the 1980 seconds ended, so too did the world that had sustained North Korea. The Soviet Union began to crumble, and China opened its markets to the West. By 1991, Pyongyang stood alone, still defiant, still secretive, and increasingly cut off from a world it no longer understood. And soon, the man who had built this kingdom of fear, Kim Il-sung, would be gone. The great leader's death and the Great Famine. As the Cold War ended, the world's communist giants fell one by one. The Soviet Union collapsed. China opened its markets to the West. But in Pyongyang, the gates only closed tighter. North Korea withdrew into itself, clinging to its old faith, Juche, the creed of total self-reliance. Kim Il-sung declared that while other socialist nations betrayed their ideals, North Korea would endure because it stood alone. And in a way, he was right. If Pyongyang had opened its doors to the world, the rigid system might have shattered. Instead, the country became more isolated than ever, a sealed fortress, preparing to outlast history itself. Yet isolation could not protect it from hunger or fear. With the loss of Soviet oil and aid, North Korea's economy was collapsing. To survive, the regime turned towards something darker, nuclear power. What began as a search for energy soon became a path to weapons. By the early 1992s, the United States grew alarmed and demanded international inspectors be allowed into North Korean nuclear sites. Pyongyang insisted its reactors were peaceful, but few believed them. In March 1993, North Korea stunned the world by withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, triggering the first nuclear crisis of the post-Cold War era. One North Korean diplomat even threatened to turn Seoul into a sea of fire. But the bluster hid weakness. The North lacked the resources to build real bombs or the will to start a war it could not win. Then, in 1994, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter flew to Pyongyang on a personal mission. Against all odds, he convinced Kim Il-sung to freeze his nuclear program in exchange for Western aid and safer energy technology. For a brief, fragile moment, peace seemed possible. Kim even agreed to meet South Korea's president in Pyongyang that July, a historic first. But fate had other plans. On the morning of July 7, 1994, Kim Il-sung collapsed at his residence in Gyeongsang Province. He had suffered a massive heart attack. North Korea's best doctors rushed to save him, but in the early hours of July 8th, the great leader was gone. The state had rehearsed this moment for years. Still, when the news finally broke, 34 hours later, the nation froze. Factories stopped. Students were gathered in schools to hear the announcement. People crowded around radios and televisions, wailing in disbelief. Across the country, 34,000 statues of Kim Il-sung became shrines. Millions poured into the streets to mourn. Was it real grief or fear? Some cried because they had lost the only world they knew. Others wept because not crying might cost them their lives. In Pyongyang, 2 million people attended the funeral procession. Crowds knelt in tears as the convoy passed, and Kim's body was placed in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, preserved in glass for eternity. He was declared eternal president, a man who would rule forever, even in death. And in that moment, his son Kim Jong-il took the stage for the first time. His father's funeral became his coronation. The old era had ended. The age of the dear leader had begun. Yet Kim Jong-il was not his father. He had no heroic war stories, no revolutionary legend. To keep the myth alive, his propaganda machine worked overtime. It claimed he was born on Mount Paektu, under a glowing new star, that rainbows appeared at his birth, and that his emotions could control the weather. It said he wrote hundreds of operas, books, and movie scripts, even inventing the hamburger. He bowled a perfect 300 his first try. He shot 11 holes in one in a single round of golf, then retired forever, since perfection could not be improved. And, according to state media, he was so divine that he never needed to use the toilet. Behind the absurdity lay a grim reality. North Korea's economy was in ruins. Debt had piled up, power stations failed, and collective farms teetered on collapse. When floods swept through the countryside in 1994, the food system broke completely. Soviet support was gone, and China offered little help. The country descended into a nightmare. The regime called it the Arduous March, a poetic name for a famine that killed hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. Crops failed. Families starved. Orphans wandered the streets, forming gangs to steal whatever food remained. The black market became the only lifeline, but it was dangerous and easily exploited. Desperation spread. In some towns, hungry crowds rioted. In others, people quietly disappeared into the mountains in search of roots and bark to eat. Even the military began to whisper. In 1995, officers in Hamhung, one of the hardest-hit cities, secretly discussed overthrowing Kim Jong-il. State security found out. Every officer was executed. Kim's response was cold and predictable. In a December 1996 speech, he dismissed the disaster as a mere food problem and blamed local officials for lacking socialist devotion. Instead of solving hunger, he created a new secret police force, the Shimwajo, to silence anyone who spoke of starvation. Saying the words famine or hunger became a crime. Thousands were arrested. Many were tortured or executed. By 1997, drought returned, deepening the misery. Only when foreign journalists and aid agencies exposed the scale of the catastrophe did Kim finally allow outside help. Pyongyang admitted that 220,000 people had died. Independent estimates suggest between 600,000 and 3.5 million. It was the darkest chapter in North Korea's history, a nation built on self-reliance, brought to its knees by its own isolation. And yet, amid the starvation, Pyongyang looked outward once again. This time, not with food convoys or peace talks, but with guns and ships. In June 1999, North Korean patrol boats crossed disputed waters near Yeonpyeong Island, chasing after rich fishing grounds. The South Korean Navy moved in, and soon the seas exploded with gunfire. It was the bloodiest clash since the Korean War, and proof that, even starving, North Korea's regime would never stop fighting shadows. Fire on the Sea, the last years of Kim Jong-il. The seas around the Korean peninsula had always been tense, but in 1999, that tension boiled over. It began as a contest of pride, then spiraled into chaos. Each day, more ships crowded the disputed waters near Yeonpyeong Island. North and South Korean patrol boats played a deadly game of intimidation, circling each other like wolves. Both sides brought in torpedo boats, loaded and ready. After a week of this silent standoff, the South Korean Navy tried a new tactic. They started bumping the enemy ships, literally ramming them to push them back. For several days, the two sides battered each other's hulls, risking disaster. Then, on June 15th, a North Korean gunboat, surrounded and panicking, opened fire. For 15 minutes, the sea erupted. Cannons roared, shells streaked across the waves, and smoke covered the horizon. When it ended, one North Korean ship was sinking, 5 were badly damaged, and at least 17 North Korean sailors were dead. The South, suffered only minor injuries. It became known as the Battle of Yeonpyeong. The world held its breath, fearing it could reignite the Korean War. But within days, the guns fell silent again. Pyongyang declared victory, claiming it had sunk 10 South Korean battleships, then buried the story entirely. For Kim Jong-il, the defeat was humiliating. He had never fought in a real war, but he saw himself as a military genius. In truth, he was obsessed with power, not tactics. Since 1991, he had held the title of Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, and his rule was defined by a single phrase, Songun, or military first. Under Songun, the army wasn't just for defense, it became the very heart of the nation. Soldiers came before civilians. The people were told to live like soldiers, disciplined, obedient, loyal. Every citizen was a warrior in Kim's endless battle against enemies both real and imagined. This military focus did create jobs, new weapons, new uniforms, new propaganda, but it couldn't fix the broken economy. By the early 2000s, even Kim saw that something had to change. Then, in 2002, came a surprise. The regime announced the July 1st measures, a set of economic reforms that seemed almost capitalist. Prices would now follow the market. Factories could buy their own materials. Private markets were officially recognized. Foreign observers called it a revolution. But inside North Korea, it was mostly a trick, an admission that the black markets, which had kept millions alive since the famine, were too powerful to destroy. Kim wasn't embracing capitalism, he was simply legalizing what he could no longer control. Still, the illusion of reform grew. In 2004, Pyongyang opened the Kaesong Industrial Park, a joint project with South Korea, just 10 miles north of the DMZ. It allowed South Korean companies to hire cheap North Korean labor, though the wages went straight to Kim's government. The project brought in valuable foreign currency and offered a rare sign of cooperation between the two Koreas. But the experiment didn't last. Fearing the spread of foreign influence, Pyongyang soon restricted who could trade in markets, first banning men, then women under 50. The economy retreated into the shadows once again. Meanwhile, North Korea's image abroad was crumbling. In 2002, a defector named Lee Soon-ok testified before the U.S. Congress, describing her 5 years in a North Korean prison camp, the beatings, forced labor, and public executions. Her words shocked the world. That same year, U.S. President George W. Bush denounced North Korea as part of an axis of evil, alongside Iraq and Iran. The message was clear. Pyongyang was once again an international pariah. Facing isolation, Kim turned once more to his favorite bargaining chip, nuclear weapons. The 1994 agreement brokered by Jimmy Carter had collapsed, and North Korea resumed secret weapons work. U.S. intelligence believed by 2002 that the North already had at least one nuclear bomb. 4 years later, in October 2006, the world watched as North Korea detonated its first successful nuclear test. The explosion was small, but the message was loud. North Korea had entered the nuclear age. Yet even nuclear weapons couldn't feed the people. By 2007, under pressure from the U.S., China, Japan, Russia, and South Korea, Kim agreed to suspend the program again in exchange for fuel and aid. Inspectors were never truly allowed in, and Pyongyang continued to test missiles in secret. Then came one of Kim's greatest blunders. In 2009, the regime launched a currency reform, a complete replacement of all banknotes. Citizens had only days to exchange old money for new, and strict limits meant most lost their savings overnight. It was meant to punish criminals and curb inflation. Instead, it wiped out entire livelihoods. Markets collapsed, shops closed, prices soared out of control. For the first time, ordinary citizens openly cursed the government. Even party officials complained that Pyongyang didn't understand what it was doing. Kim panicked. By April 2010, he reversed the policy, reopened the markets, and executed the officials blamed for the disaster. It was the closest the regime had come to collapse from within. But if Kim feared rebellion, he hid it behind another show of strength. Later that year, the fragile peace on the Yellow Sea shattered once more. In March 2010, the South Korean warship ROKS Cheonan exploded and sank near Bungyung Island. 46 sailors died. Investigators found fragments of a North Korean torpedo. Pyongyang denied everything, calling it a Western plot, but few believed them. That November, the North struck again. Artillery batteries on the coast opened fire on Yeonpyeong Island, raining nearly 200 shells onto homes and bases. 4 people died, and dozens were wounded before the South returned fire. The exchange lasted barely an hour, but it was the most violent clash between the Koreas in decades. North Korea called it self-defense. South Korea called it murder. And the world watched, once again, as the peninsula teetered on the edge of war. Kim Jong-il had overseen famine, terror, and provocation. His final years would bring one more active legacy, the passing of power to his son, Kim Jong-un, and the birth of yet another chapter in the story of the world's most secretive nation, the young general and his new kingdom. In December 2011, death came once more for the House of Kim. On the 19th, North Korean state television announced that Kim Jong-il had died of a heart attack 2 days earlier. According to the official story, the dear leader passed away aboard his personal train, gazing out at the snowy countryside. South Korean intelligence wasn't convinced. Their data suggested the train hadn't moved at all. But whatever the truth, it was buried beneath layers of propaganda and myth. The morning that followed was eerily familiar. Once again, Pyongyang was filled with sobbing crowds. People fell to their knees, pounding the frozen ground in grief. State TV showed endless images of weeping citizens, though no one could tell where sincerity ended and fear began. Kim Jong-il's reign had lasted just 17 years, less than half his father's time in power, but it left deep scars. He had led the nation through famine, poverty, and isolation. His promises of power had turned into hunger and fear. Yet in death, the myth-making began again. Propaganda declared that at the moment he died, the skies glowed red and snowstorms stopped. He was posthumously given the title of Grand Marshal, forever tied to the military he had worshipped. His body was placed beside his father's in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, where both men now lie in glass coffins, eternal symbols of a dynasty that refuses to fade. But now, a new Kim would rise. His name was Kim Jong-un, and unlike his predecessors, he was almost a mystery. Young, untested, and barely known outside North Korea, he was suddenly expected to rule a nation of 25 million. Originally, the throne wasn't meant for him at all. His older half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, had been the chosen heir until he was caught sneaking into Japan with a fake passport to visit Disneyland in 2001. The embarrassment cost him everything. The succession shifted, and the quiet, basketball-loving son studying abroad in Switzerland became the new heir. Classmates later remembered Jong-un as polite, reserved, and fond of video games. He loved Michael Jordan and drew sketches of him during class. Nobody imagined this shy teenager would one day rule one of the world's most secretive countries. When his father suffered a stroke in 2008, plans changed quickly. By 2009, whispers spread through Pyongyang a new Kim had been chosen. The young man was suddenly thrust into military and political ceremonies, made a 4-star general despite no service, and began appearing beside his father at public events. Then, far sooner than anyone expected, power fell into his hands. Kim Jong-un's rule began with uncertainty. He lacked the war hero image of Kim Il-sung and the political experience of Kim Jong-il, but he moved fast. His first major act was to shift power away from the army and back to the Workers' Party, reducing the dominance of the generals who had grown powerful under his father's Song-gun policy. A new State Affairs Commission replaced the old military council, signaling that Kim's focus would be economic and political, not purely martial. Still, his early years proved he was no soft reformer. The most powerful man in Pyongyang after him was his uncle, Jang Song-thaek, a veteran official with decades of experience and allies across the government. Foreign analysts saw Jang as the regime's second-in-command, perhaps even a rival. By late 2013, their uneasy partnership collapsed. The two reportedly clashed over control of fisheries in the Yellow Sea, a trivial issue that spiraled into open hostility. Gunfire was exchanged between their loyalists. Soon after, Jang was arrested during a party meeting and branded a traitor worse than a dog. In a televised show trial, he was accused of treason, corruption, and even not clapping enthusiastically enough. Days later, he was executed by firing squad. Several of his allies were purged as well, including one official reportedly burned alive with a flamethrower. The message was clear: Kim Jong-un was in control. Yet this new Kim also wanted to look different, modern, approachable, even friendly. He smiled more in public, visited amusement parks, and brought his glamorous wife, Ri Sol-ju, into the spotlight. North Koreans had never seen a leader walk hand in hand with his wife before. It felt new. It felt human. Kim embraced some elements of foreign culture up to a point. He attended a Western-style pop concert in 2012, complete with Disney characters and American music. And his most bizarre diplomatic connection came through his love of basketball. In 2013, former NBA star Dennis Rodman accepted an invitation to visit Pyongyang. What followed was one of the strangest friendships in modern history. The two men laughed together, watched games, exchanged gifts, and even celebrated birthdays. Rodman later sang "Happy Birthday" to Kim in front of thousands, a surreal moment that blurred the line between comedy and politics. But beneath the smiles and sports, Kim's control remained absolute. His regime still feared outside influence. Foreign movies, Western fashion, and especially K-pop were banned. The state called it a vicious cancer. In 2017, 7 people were executed for secretly sharing South Korean songs. Haircuts were regulated, internet access restricted to a state-run network, and Western-style clothing outlawed. The message was simple: foreign culture was a threat, and purity must be preserved. To outsiders, it all seems absurd. But to Kim Jong-un, these controls are survival. In his mind, it was openness, the lure of Western life, that destroyed the Soviet Union. North Korea would not share that fate. And so, the young general with the Western education would rule a kingdom frozen in time, a nation still walled off from the world, held together by fear, loyalty, and the unbroken line of the Kim dynasty. The people behind the curtain. North Korea is a land of contrasts. While most citizens live in poverty, scraping by on rations and government wages, A small middle class has quietly emerged in Pyongyang and a few other cities. Expensive restaurants, department stores, and private taxis cater to these new elites, government officials, army officers, and successful traders who learned how to navigate the system. Their world feels distant from the rest of the country. In rural villages, families still cook over coal stoves, and electricity might flicker on for only a few hours a day. But in the capital, the wealthy dine on imported wine, wear Western suits, and drive foreign cars. The gap between rich and poor has never been wider. Still, defectors remind us that North Koreans are not so different from anyone else. They laugh, they love, they argue, they dream. Politics may dominate their surroundings, but everyday life, family, work, romance, hobbies, fills their minds far more than ideology. Some truly believe in the system. Others quietly question it. Most simply try to survive. Beyond the slogans and the missiles, North Korea is a country of ordinary people living in extraordinary circumstances. But Kim Jong-un's ambitions are anything but ordinary. He has revived the old Byungjin policy parallel development, the belief that economic strength and nuclear power must grow together. For Kim, the bomb is not just a weapon. It is the symbol of survival. The nation's future, he believes, depends on its ability to project fear. Education has followed that vision. The brightest students are funneled into nuclear and missile sciences, their studies focused on advancing the regime's strategic goals. And Kim has proven that commitment with action. In December 2012, he celebrated the launch of the Kwangmyongsong-3 satellite, supposedly a scientific mission, but clearly a test of long-range rocket technology. The world condemned it, but Kim pressed on. 2 months later, in February 2013, North Korea announced another underground nuclear test. A diplomat at a UN conference in Geneva even threatened the final destruction of South Korea. It became a pattern, a cycle of provocation and retreat. Tensions would rise, then fade, only to return again. But everything changed in 2017, when Pyongyang tested the Hwasong-15, its first true intercontinental ballistic missile. Suddenly, the threat was no longer theoretical. North Korea could, in theory, reach the continental United States. Yet the most modern weapons in Kim's arsenal are not nuclear, they are digital. The regime's cyber army is one of its most powerful tools. Hacking, theft, and online sabotage have become new fronts in North Korea's global war. A 2019 UN report estimated that Pyongyang's hackers had stolen over $2 billion through cybercrime. The world first saw their power in 2014, when hackers attacked Sony Pictures after it released The Interview, a comedy about assassinating Kim Jong-un. North Korea called it an act of war, and soon Sony's servers were crippled, its data leaked to the world. President Obama called it cyber vandalism, but it was a warning, a digital bomb with no smoke or fire. 2 years later, North Korean hackers infiltrated the Bangladesh National Bank, nearly stealing $1 billion through fake transfers. They escaped with $81 million before being caught. In 2017, their WannaCry ransomware infected more than 300,000 computers worldwide, shutting down hospitals, companies, and government systems. The damages reached into the billions. Kim Jong-un's digital soldiers had proven that even a small, isolated nation could wound the giants of the modern world. Behind this shadow army lies a powerful education system. Since 1959, North Korea has offered free universal schooling, now extended to 12 years under Kim Jong-un's reforms. Children learn math, science, and literature, but also devotion to the Kim family. In universities, only the most loyal and gifted are trained in nuclear science, computing, or military engineering. Many dream of studying abroad, and a lucky few are sent to China or Europe to learn skills the regime can use. The government has also cautiously opened its doors to the world, just enough to control what comes in. Tourists, always escorted and watched, are shown only the bright, polished face of the country. The statues, the dams, the grand boulevards. They stay at the Yanggakdo International Hotel, where the 5th floor is permanently closed to guests rumored to be filled with listening devices. And yet, even through this stage-managed theater, one truth slips through. Beneath the rigid ideology and silence, there are real people living real lives, longing for the same simple things: safety, love, and a future they can call their own. Escape, assassination, and an uncertain future. In North Korea, escape is an act of desperation, and often a death sentence. Those caught trying to flee are shot on sight or disappear forever into the gulag. Underground networks still work to help defectors reach safety, guiding them through mountains and rivers into China. But under Kim Jong-un, the border has become a fortress. According to activist Hyun Woo, who helps defectors cross into China, the success rate has dropped from nearly 50% under Kim Jong-il to less than 10% today. Freedom has never been harder to find. Even within the ruling family, there is no true safety. Kim Jong-un's own half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, learned this the hard way. Once the favored son, he had lived comfortably abroad after losing his place as heir. But in interviews, he warned that without reform, North Korea will collapse. Those words sealed his fate. On February 13, 2017, inside Kuala Lumpur International Airport, 2 women approached him. One splashed liquid in his face. Another pressed a damp cloth to his mouth. Minutes later, Kim Jong-nam was dead. Tests revealed VX nerve agent, one of the world's most lethal chemical weapons. The assassins, a Vietnamese and an Indonesian woman, claimed they thought it was a prank for a hidden camera show. They had been duped by North Korean operatives who vanished before authorities arrived. The world knew who had ordered it, but justice never came. That same year, global politics took an unpredictable turn with the election of Donald Trump. His fiery tweets called Kim "Little Rocket Man," mocking his missiles and threatening fire and fury. The war of words stunned diplomats, yet, strangely, it opened the door to something new. In 2018, after years of hostility, North Korea joined the Winter Olympics in Seoul. Kim's sister attended the opening ceremony, smiling beside South Korean leaders. Soon after, Kim met South Korean President Moon Jae-in at the demilitarized zone, a moment broadcast worldwide. They promised peace and talked of denuclearization. Then, in June 2018, came the unthinkable: a meeting between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump in Singapore. Handshakes, smiles, and photo ops filled the news. Trump promised to halt military exercises. Kim pledged a path toward peace. For the first time, the leaders of the 2 nations spoke face to face. And in 2019, Trump even stepped across the border at Panmunjom, the first U.S. president ever to set foot in North Korea. For a brief moment, the world dared to hope, but the illusion faded quickly. By late 2019, talks collapsed. Kim refused to give up his nuclear weapons, and the tests resumed. Once again, North Korea withdrew behind its walls. Then came COVID-19 and isolation became a shield. While the rest of the world battled the pandemic, North Korea closed its borders completely. Officially, not a single infection occurred in 2020 or 2021, though few believed it. When cases finally appeared in May 2022, Kim called it the nation's greatest challenge since the revolution. Strict lockdowns, sealed cities, and executions for quarantine violations followed. By September, Pyongyang claimed victory over the virus, reporting only 74 deaths out of millions of cases, statistics the world met with skepticism. In 2023, the country returned to its familiar rhythm missile tests, bold declarations, and silence from within. A failed spy satellite launch in August made headlines, as did the bizarre defection of U.S. soldier Travis King, who sprinted across the border during a tour and was later returned. Kim Jong-un even met Vladimir Putin, pledging friendship and support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Today, the North remains trapped between past and future, clinging to its old allies, haunted by its own ideology. The income gap between North and South is 15-1, the largest divide between neighbors anywhere on Earth. Some say reform will destroy the regime. Others say avoiding reform will destroy the nation. For now, North Korea endures silent, defiant, and frozen in time. And so the story continues. A country born from war, sustained by fear, and kept alive by the dreams and nightmares of the Kim dynasty. And that's it for today's journey through history and language. If these stories moved you, remember every new word you learn keeps a fragment of history alive. So keep listening, keep feeling, and keep exploring the world through English. Thank you for joining me here on MC Time Trackers. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because next time we'll travel even deeper into the past together. Until then, take care, keep learning, and never stop exploring the story of humanity.